Greetings, everybody. And if you see this recording, is because I had some problems, technical problems for the presentation. So my apologies. Today, I'd like to speak about asset management in indigenous communities. My name is Guy Felio. Here is my brief background. I'm not going to go over it, but I've been doing work with First Nations indigenous communities in Canada for the last 10, 15 years now, mostly on asset management and climate risk assessments. And you can find more details about my background at my website at the bottom of the slide. The World Bank defines indigenous peoples as distinct and social and cultural groups that share collective ancestral ties to the lands and natural resources. And this is very important from the perspective of asset management because there is this attachment and reliance and respect of lands and natural resources that drive the priorities and prioritization of how to deal with those assets in a context of asset management, considering that they have particular cultures, livelihoods, reliance on the land, and so on. So from an asset management perspective, it's always important to consider these characteristics. First Nations or Indigenous communities in Canada, we have about 630 First Nations communities, as you can see from the map. They're located mostly in the south of the country, but there are a number of them which are in the northern parts, which basically indicates that, these communities will be remote, difficult to access, typically small communities. And you have a reference if you want to learn more about the Indigenous people of Canada at the bottom of the slide. The First Nations, and typically in Canada, are unique forms of local government. They provide all the assets, all the services through the assets that they own and operate that typically you would have a municipal, provincial, or state and central governments provide. So in addition to the municipal type services like water, wastewater, and roads and recreation and so on, the First Nations also have to provide services like education, like health, like justice, and so on. And therefore, they really provide a very broad range of services, and therefore the assets that they have to provide those services are very broad as well. Typically in Canada, the First Nation communities are small. We only have two that have more than 10,000 members and 7 that have more than 5,000 members. And when we say members, it doesn't mean that all these members reside in the communities. They may be outside, but they're still part of the membership of the First Nations. And therefore, all of these, whether they're small or large, have to provide all the services to their members, including those that are coming from, that are not living in the community, but are outside of the community. This is a typical slide or images from the various assets in the First Nation community. This is for the Moose Cree First Nation, which is northern Ontario. And you can see that there's some cultural and heritage assets. There's educational assets as well. There is housing and all the elements that are related to housing, including electricity. And many communities have owned and operate their own distribution system. We also have the water treatment plant and all the other municipal assets that you would find, for example, hydrants and drainage systems and so on. This particular community is an island, and therefore, as you can see here in the image, during the summer, it is water transportation, so barges for heavy equipment, vehicles, and so on, but what they call water taxis for people. In the winter, the river is frozen, and therefore, you have an ice road. But in the shoulder season, so in the spring and in spring and fall, then when there's too much ice that is not thick enough for traveling on the road, on the river, then helicopter is the means of transportation. So in terms of asset management in First Nations in Canada, certainly it has it covers all the elements that we would expect from the asset management in a municipality. So this is just an example of some questions and the related activities that are with those questions. So the inventory, the valuation, the condition and the service life, the needs assessment, and capital and O&M, and then after that, the planning. And the reason we put them like this is basically what you see in First Nations in Canada is that they have a wealth of information, of data, because a number of the assets that they have are funded by the federal government. Therefore, every 3 years for those funded assets, they have to do asset condition inspections and reporting. So, for basically the last 20 years, they've been accumulating a lot of data on the condition of assets. But we also have what is called here the PSAB, which is the Public Sector Accounting Board. This is the asset accounting and reporting, which since 2009 requires public organizations, including First Nations, to report on the value of their assets in their annual financial statements. And therefore, a lot of information is collected and creating a register of the assets that is very useful in developing the asset management plan, plus as well the insurance. So you can see that from an inventory perspective, a lot of data that exists. From the valuation perspective, again, using the existing documents. So even if the asset accounting PSAP 3150 works mostly on historical costs plus developing the net book value, but certainly there's a link between what we can do with that data to the replacement value that we would use in the asset management planning. In terms of, again, the condition and the expected service life, we still have a lot of data available from the needs assessment. The asset condition rating system, ACRES, provides information on what needs to be done. A lot of it is from the maintenance perspective, but there is also some capital requirements. And then again, from the capital and O&M plan. So a lot of data that exists, that has been collected and still continues to be collected, that in order to make the asset management planning and forecast of the needs and so on, then this is where basically you integrate all that in the life cycle analysis, looking at performance indicators, so condition, capacity to meet demand, functionality, and so on, and then the asset management plans themselves. So in terms of the principles that I promote with First Nations is the fact that they have to focus on the service. The assets exist only to provide a service to the members of the community, and therefore, if the asset does not provide a service, then the question is, why do you have it? And those assets, the services could be a wide range, mobility, culture, economic development, and so on. The second one that I promote with First Nations communities is that once they provide the service, then they have to really focus on defining the quality of it. And we talk about levels of service, and those in asset management are very familiar with the terminology and how to develop this level of service. But certainly, the level of service means different things to different people, and we have to clarify and clarify the expectations and manage the expectations as well. And this is an image that I use, to illustrate, what is level of service. And basically, again, we're talking about small communities, and we need to explain to the members, what we're doing with asset management. And the question that I remind our asset managers is, think about what the service means to them. And the idea is that, from the members of the public perspective, all they want to know is that when you flush, it'll go away. They don't want to know about the pipes or the pumps and the treatment systems and so on. So we need to define what is the service, what is the level of service that is acceptable and affordable and desirable, as well as what happens if the service fails in terms of the consequences to the community. The other one is the third principle is really looking at with respect to level of service, what are the operation and maintenance requirements, and realizing as asset managers know that the O&M costs over the life cycle of the asset can be 4 times greater than the cost of construction of the asset, so the cost of acquisition. And that is a major problem in terms of the funding mechanisms that First Nations have regarding the O&M funding, and ensuring that the assets are maintained in a state of good repair. And the fourth principle really is to look at all these infrastructure services and assets are interdependent. When you have your housing, it is dependent on your water, your sanitary system, to your electricity, to the roads, to the drainage, and so on. And therefore, when looking at investments in the various different types of assets, the community has to look at what's going to happen to the other assets, particularly from a risk management perspective. And this is one of the slides that I use in terms of illustrating the reliance or the costing and the major impacts of O&M on the life cycle costs of the assets. And then you would recognize this from the Blanchard 1979 iceberg analogy, but these are a couple of graphs here that come from various sources, which really look at that the maintenance, repairs, and renewals and operating costs are about 70% of the total life cycle costs. But if you only consider design and construction and not disposal, then it would be closer to 80%, which is something that has come out from the a publication back in 2006, which was an infra guide document. The asset management drivers for First Nations in Canada are very similar to what you find in municipalities and in other countries. So aging infrastructure, population growth, increased accountability, but also, climate change is becoming one of the major drivers in terms of looking at being able to plan the assets and replacements, operations and maintenance, and considering risks due to climate change impacts. And when we look at really the ingredients for success in implementing asset management plans within the communities, there are a number of factors. Again, similar to what you would find for municipalities, but certainly you want the chief and council buy-in and support, and that may mean, for example, developing and adopting asset management policy so that it really gives confidence to the staff that is working in asset management that they have the support from their decision makers. Certainly having a champion that can drive asset management forward, whether that person is a member of council, is a member of senior management, or somebody that is within the various departments. It doesn't really matter, but that person really has to be a person that is respected, knowledgeable, and can mobilize people. As typical in other private or public sector organizations, the asset management team being a multidiscipline and cuts across the various departments, finance, public works, and housing, engineering, operations, planning, and so on. Again, integrating a solid asset management team, access to resources, whether they're human, material, and financial, and also then looking at external partnerships. Many First Nations in Canada are affiliated with the Tribal Council. The Tribal Council has more technical competencies than the individual First Nations, and therefore that is something that is useful to have. In terms of First Nations in Canada, what has happened that related to asset management? Well, basically you can see that there is here back in 1983, 1998, there were a number of federal government initiatives. But really 2005, there are a number of things that happened that are directly related to asset management, including this implementation of the asset condition reporting system, ACRES, that I mentioned earlier, plus a number of programs, funding programs, and so on. And then in 2009, then it was the Public Sector Accounting Board Tangible Capital Assets reporting that I mentioned earlier. Now there's a big discussions between the Indigenous Services Canada federal government and the Assembly of First Nations to look at asset management initiatives and look at how to improve the assessment and funding of needs in First Nations communities. And really, when we're thinking about this in terms of asset management, risk management, and asset accounting or asset reporting, we really have to consider that all the information that is needed for asset management, risk management, and financial asset reporting is the same. We're talking about an inventory condition, residual life. Now, the value may be slightly different because from an accounting perspective, they will look at it at the historical and net book value, but the rest is the same. So everybody, whether it's finance, accounting, public works, and so on, they are using the same type of information, different levels of details, obviously. And this is one of the things that I do when I go into a First Nation and start working or accompanying them in their asset management journey, is really to collect the information and consolidate it and validate it, because ultimately, the ideal is that they will have one asset inventory or register where it gets updated by somebody which I call the custodian of the inventory. So one person responsible for taking this information and collating it and validating it once the initial inventory has been created. Now, again, we're not talking about large organizations. Some of the organizations I'm working with now have 300 people on reserve or 500 people on reserve. So we're not talking about a large number of assets. So one person can easily update that on a regular basis and certainly on an annual basis. There are some tools available to First Nations. The one on the right here is an asset management guide for British Columbia First Nations. The one on the left here, this is from the Ontario First Nations Technical Services Corporation. This is the First Nations Infrastructure Resilience Toolkit, and I'm proud to have been the lead author of that guide. And actually, that toolkit has three modules. Module 1 deals specifically with data and data sources and data management. Module 2 deals with climate risk assessments, and Module 3 deals with asset management. The typical framework that you would find in other asset management documents or guides. This is just the high-level overview of the framework that is in this toolkit, but you're talking about the asset portfolio, lifecycle analysis, the needs assessments, whether it's operations and maintenance or capital, and then after that, how to develop those investment plans and management plans and so on, with monitoring and reporting, and sections related to finance and legal, and then also the planning side. This is, aligned with ISO 55000 series of standards, which is really, one of the standards or the main standard that this toolkit, focuses on. By the way, this toolkit won an award in 2019 by the Ontario Consulting Engineering Awards. And there was also a component of building capacity where we provided, I think it was close to more than 200 individuals that participated in various training sessions across the province of Ontario. So we're really focused on these standards, as I mentioned. All of you that are in asset management know them well, so I'm not going to present in detail. And you also know this regarding the framework. And really, when we're looking at First Nations, also we're working very much with their elected officials, their decision makers, the chief and council, and so on. and really ensuring that what we're doing is aligned with their strategic plans, their visions, and so on. So this because that's where a lot of the cultural aspects come in terms of protecting the language, for example, protecting the land, and a number of activities and that are related to assets that need to be considered. The various steps that we use in terms of the process is, as I mentioned, you start with the community vision and values, and also look at, their housing plans, the strategic plans, their economic development plans, and so on, and then really get into the asset management system, which we promote the use of a policy, we develop a strategy and a roadmap, and that gets updated continuously because as the maturity of the First Nation progresses related to asset management, and we are updating the roadmap for them, and then the asset management plans, and just completed an update for one of the communities. And really what we see is how these plans being updated allow the community to see how their, for example, infrastructure deficit progresses, or how their needs for O&M progresses, particularly in these times where we have seen very high inflation costs, whether it is the consumer price index or the non-residential building price indices and so on. Everything has been going up. So therefore, from an O&M perspective, the needs continue to grow. So typical results that we see in asset management plans that I have worked on in the past for First Nations is basically, this is an awareness report. This is a First Nation that I'm working with now. So we do an awareness report because we have workshops and presentations. We really want to engage decision makers, the staff, and so on. We'll do a self-assessment at the beginning of the process and at the end of the process, just to see how they have progressed, and looking at developing a draft asset management policy that takes time to adopt because it has to go through consultations and so on. So we do it early, and after that we help engage their decision makers and the senior management in adopting this, and then the asset management strategy and the roadmap. This is, what a self-assessment would look like. We have 4 categories. This is one of them, the corporate asset management. And there's some subcategories regarding whether they have, or they're thinking about having an asset management policy, if they have a strategy, have they done work in levels of service and so on. And then basically, it is reported on a scale of 1 to 5. So this particular example, the First Nation here is probably at the beginning of level 2, and then moving towards level 3. And then what we will do is define some potential actions in the short term that they can do in terms of progressing, and then potential actions for medium term. And for example, this one here talks about exploring how climate risk can be incorporated in design and planning of assets and initiatives. So this is a typical illustration of what the self-assessment results would look like. Then we get into the planning. So this is really the major part of the initiative, developing the asset management plan. So looking at the data systems, the demand, the levels of service, the asset data management, and so on. Data collection phase, we will look at the typical sources that I mentioned earlier, plus the list of insured assets, their housing assets, and the funding that they receive from the Indigenous Services Canada, the federal government on this. And then after that, you have the consolidation of all the assets into one single inventory with a validation process, because as you would expect, when you have a register, which is more related to financial side of things, whether you have the right information in terms of the how the assets are named and so on, they're all different. And so we need to consolidate that and create this consolidated, validated inventory that is used by, hopefully not only for the asset management, but also for the insurance and also for the financial side of things. And this is what it would look like, for example, in this particular case. We have a community. This is a small community. This is a community, if I recall correctly, that has about 320 or 350 residents. So you can see that they have a lot of assets. You know, they have housing assets, which typically in a municipality, only some type of public housing would be included, but the majority would not. But here we have, you know, 86 residential assets, about 22 buildings, 3 bridges and vehicles and so on. And so that gives an overall overview of what they own. But then we're also looking at, you know, how much the value of this. So you can think about this a community of 360 or so people, then they have, you know, basically an asset portfolio worth about $62 million, which is huge compared to what you would have in a municipality. But again, because they have to provide different all kind of services, including health, including education, and so on, which typically a municipality will not do. So you see again that the major portion of the value of their portfolio is buildings and residential. We create, you know, a graphs in terms of, you know, when these assets were built, and so, you know, you can see that the number of roads here are relatively old, you know, 50 plus years. But here, what you can see is that there were major investments that were done in 2022, which basically were a major renewal of their water system. So there was the building itself, which was the water treatment plant, plus some other buildings related to pump stations and so on. And then after that, from a public works perspective, this was a treatment system and the pipes and the hydrants and so on. So again, very easy to see that this community here, from, you know, the housing perspective, which is the residential red here, you see, you know, some houses that have reached about half their service life, so about 20 years old. But then you see a bunch here which are worth more than $4 million Canadian dollars in 1984. So those are 40 plus years, and those are the ones that are going to be that needing attention very shortly. We look at the 20-year asset replacement forecast and looking at you know, the various components of these buildings, particularly that would need replacement. So we try to lump everything into various archetypes so that, for example, we can see that there will be major electrical work done in a number of the residential units at a particular time, let's say that 5 years from now, so the community can start planning, because they may not have a certified electrician, you know, on the reserve. They would have to bring somebody. But if they have major work to be done on, you know, various or several of their buildings, then they may decide to basically hire somebody or contract somebody, you know, for, you know, a year or so, then to do all that work, and then, you know, save or have cost savings. We also look at this deficit. So basically, you know, when we're looking at this 20-year deficit, these are all the assets that are past the due date. Now, you know, obviously they're still functioning. Some of them are in poor condition, some of them are in fair condition because they've been maintained. But at least it gives the community an idea of the amount of investments that need really to be protected and considered in terms of their renewal plans. And this particular community would have to think about an annual renewal replacement value of about $2 million a year over the next 20 years to meet the requirements of replacing the assets when their service life is due. Now, we have default service lives, but in many cases, what happens is that the service life of the assets is shorter than what would be typical in design considerations because of the lack of funding from O&M. So therefore, the assets are not maintained in a state of good repair. I was mentioning how it is broken down into the various subcomponents. Well, this is an example here. So you have, you know, the structure itself, the foundation, the envelope, access, roof, and grounds, and so on. And those are the typical subcomponents that you would find in the cost breakdown structures, for example. And looking at the investment needs, so what are the costs for operations, what are the costs for maintenance as well, and then looking at how much funding that they get, and the estimated annual O&M needs for this particular community. We're talking about $2.7 million, so it's quite high. Again, buildings and housing are the major elements or assets that require this O&M needs. But we also look at, how much the Indigenous Services Canada, which is a federal agency that funds the O&M for those assets that they have provided funding to build. And what we do is we look at the total amount of O&M that is needed for all the assets in the portfolio, how much they're getting into funding, and then what is the annual gap. And so what you can see here is that basically this community, receives about 25% of the total of the O&M required for all their assets. So they have to find funds elsewhere to be able to pay for that. And so in summary, the approach to asset management planning in First Nations has been, from my perspective, just a guide in their journey. So there's a lot of capacity development. There's a lot of guidance provided, a lot of resources provided. But ultimately, the idea is after we've gone through the 3 phases, from the awareness to the planning to the implementation, then they have the tools and they have the knowledge so that they can continue updating their asset management plans and so on. So the approach has been really setting up the objectives of the journey, looking at their self-assessment. So what do they need? Do they have all the competencies? Do they need to can they go it alone, or can they work with their tribal council or other communities? Building the team, and then planning, what the roadmap is for that journey, and realizing that that roadmap is going to be updated on a regular basis, because there will be some roadblocks and so on that you need to bypass. Training, obviously, I mentioned, and the capacity development or capacity enhancement in some cases, and then really getting ready and starting the journey. So the approach itself as well has been to celebrate arriving at the first milestone. So for example, I'm finishing one update of a plan, and sometime next week we will have a presentation to the chief and council, and it's really to celebrate the achievements of the team in terms of asset management. And also part of the last step is to look at, what does the community need to do in order to sustain asset management within the community. So, do they have the right people? More and more, I see communities hiring an asset manager, which is great, because it's an indication that they're really thinking ahead about asset management being part of the business that to provide services to the communities. But looking at material resources and so on, and very often they ask about, well, what about software? We want we can get software. And my philosophy has been, let's make sure that you know what you're doing, the data is complete and so on. And then after that, once you have experience developing and updating your asset management plan for a couple of years, then you can start thinking about how you're going to enhance it. And software, certainly can enhance that, but it could be also having access to GIS and so on. So, learn to walk before you start running. And a number of other resources, but for example, this is another initiative which, when you're talking about asset management plans, the way that it's been done is typically looking at, okay, existing assets. But what we see is that there's a lot of, growth taking place in First Nations communities. The population growth is about 2% in First Nations communities, while, without counting immigration in other communities, and the population is going down in Canada. This was a study done in 2023, and this talks about infrastructure capital and O&M needs study, looking at growth, looking at all services, and basically looks at projecting what is needed in terms of assets. Now, there's a companion to that study, which was looking at what are the climate costs associated to those needs. And this is another study that was done in terms of looking at comparing level of service between the First Nations and municipalities. So this study here provides information on the high level of service for services, but also for assets. And then there's a comparison that was done between a First Nation community and a municipality. But what really came out as an important was the fact that this was really the context is key. And the same if you were to compare two municipalities, you would say the context of one is different than the other. So there's really, difficult to make a, comparison that ends up with, one is better and two is better. The same with First Nations. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm sorry that I could not be with you, but you have my email here, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Thank you very much.